In 1961, Taylor published his most controversial book, The Origins of the Second World War. It caused a storm of outrage because Taylor implied that Hitler had not had any master plan for starting a major European war. Taylor proposed a new and uncomfortable picture of Hitler, not the man evilly determined to have conflict at any cost, but Hitler the opportunist, the reckless gambler who stumbled into war only at the last minute because the indecision and the weakness of the Western appeasers made it worth his while. The book combined classic Taylor ingredients, a refusal to accept even the most sacrosanct historical explanations, and inflammatory conclusions about an event still fresh in the minds of his readers. It was a bestseller. Other historians rounded on him in a fury, most famously Hugh Trevor Roper in this televised debate.
Most of us have always believed that Hitler planned the Second World War as part of a general scheme of world conquest. A whole school of professional historians substantiates this view, and a vast amount of literature has been written about these aggressive aims of Hitler and his whole philosophy of world domination and his policy. This view has now been challenged in a most provocative way in a recently published book, The Origins of the Second World War. The author of this book, Mr. AJP Taylor, has said, for instance, the war of 1939, far from being premeditated, was a mistake, the result on both sides of diplomatic blunders. Can we now move on to the second half of this Czechoslovak crisis, the occupation of Prague by Hitler in March 1939. Trevor Roper, would you accept Taylor's interpretation of that?
Certainly not.
Will you explain why?
Taylor maintains that the occupation of Prague by Hitler, if I've interpreted him correctly, was an unfortunate development which Hitler himself hadn't thought of before, which was forced upon him by events in Slovakia. That he would have much preferred to have stopped at Munich. That is the implication of Taylor's book.
What is
No,
that?
my implication is that, as usual, Hitler didn't think about any of these things.
But
what Hitler said to himself, or this is how it seems to me, you can see it from his very negations, from his policy of drift in the whole autumn of 1938 up into 1939. Something else will happen.
The interpretation behind the book was all wrong because he totally failed to take any account of the dynamism of Nazism.
I've never managed to think, for instance, of a single subject for a book. Yes, I'm wrong. I thought of one, and it brought ruin and disaster upon me. I alone thought of the origins of the Second World War, and I was abused by this for 20 years, so I've been vindicated now.
He insisted on treating Hitler as if he were, as he explicitly said, in foreign politics he was just like any other European statesman, only rather tougher. And that is simply untrue because he was a different kind of person, and this can be demonstrated.
From my point of view, his real contribution to history was that he was the first person to put a jemmy into the received notion of how the Second World War started. And I don't mean in September 1939, I mean from 1933 onwards. And Taylor actually did approach this topic with a completely open mind, and he did demonstrate to me that the blame was very widely spread and that there were all sorts of wrong turnings taken. It was never too late, almost like World War I. It was never too late to have done it differently.
I think it was one of the greatest books of the second half of the 20th century. What Origins did was to say, let's not look at Hitler as the progenitor of the Holocaust. Hitler, he says, is not a monster. He's just another German statesman. So therefore, if you look at him as a foreign policy actor, and you look at what he actually does, he's not planning this war. Therefore, what it did was to force people to look at the origins of the war, not as a moral issue, but as another piece of one might say, diplomatic history. People didn't like this. That book caused a moral firestorm around Taylor's head in a way that I'm sure he didn't anticipate and would have been horrified, actually, had he thought this might have been the case. So it's a book that broke the logjam of history. It's a brilliant book. It forced people actually to think about what they were doing. But at the same time, it probably did appalling things for Taylor's immediate and long-term reputation.
But Taylor's reputation among historians had been under attack for years. Nowhere was this more apparent than at Oxford, where Taylor's celebrity